Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of March 12th, 2023. Today, we have a fascinating conversation in store for you regarding wearable fitness trackers and some of their functionality, some of their limitations, and some of the applications of these insights to the development of life monitoring devices that could be of great assistance to cryonicists. I'm Gennady Stolyarov II, chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, and with us today, we have a panel of our U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including our vice chairman for the next 4 months and director of visual art, Art Ramon Garcia, our legislative director, Jason Geringer, our director of longevity outreach, Ben Ballweg, and our special guest for today is Nikki Olson, who is a software engineer and writer and researcher in the field of futurism and in transhumanist topics. She is one of the world's top experts in the field of life monitoring as it pertains to cryonics. She has developed, prototyped, and tested multiple products for cryonics purposes, and she is also a member of the Alcor Research and Development Committee. So welcome, Nikki, and please give us an overview of some of your research and some of its key implications for fitness trackers as well as for life monitoring devices that cryonicists could be equipped with going forward.
Okay, hi. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. So I'll just go through a bit of the history of my experience with this topic. It started about 2.5 years ago. I started attending the Sunday Zoom Hangout with Chris Court. And so that's basically about a 3-hour Zoom Hangout every week where we just kind of talk about all kinds of cryonics topics. And this topic of life monitoring came up. I had been working with software in one way or another for about 8 years at that point, but I had just begun my professional career at that point. And so I had some experience with writing cell phone apps, but not that much. And I just got interested in the topic at that point. Chris and some others were saying, well, this is this problem that's plagued cryonics and no one has been able to solve it. And why don't we have this with all this technology? We have this Apple Watch. It can do these great things. Why don't we have this cryonics alarm? And I thought, off the bat, like a lot of people do, oh, yeah, totally. You could write that. That's so easy to write. And there was actually someone else on the call who was also a software developer who was like, oh yeah, I could write that in a weekend. And I was like, oh, okay. Because I didn't have that much experience with cell phone apps, as I said. And this person also had experience with the Apple Watch, writing stuff for the Apple Watch, which I didn't have at that point. And we're like, well, if they think they can do it in a weekend, I'll definitely take on this task because that's a really important project. And at that point, I was actually fairly new to cryonics as well. Had really only gotten seriously involved maybe a year before that. So I'd heard of some cases of people having unattended death situations where they were even very devout cryonicists who had moved locally to try and be a local case and end up not being discovered for 1 to 2 days after they had passed away. So I was moved by this, the topic from that angle as well, but it also it seemed like an interesting, kind kind of technology puzzle to solve and to write a good app. So I got into it and started with the Apple Watch because this guy was like, and he never showed up to the meetings again after that. Like that was his contribution. Yeah, it's easy. I could write it in a weekend, and we never saw him again. So I thought I'll start with the Apple Watch because that's the device that I had, and I thought that's the best one. And the problems just started unfolding from there. It just turns out that it is a much more difficult problem than you would think. You have aspects of the Apple Watch that are, a serious medical device, like they can accurately detect atrial fibrillation, and they have like things like fall detection, and they seem reliable in the sense that they'll send you notifications on time for things, and it just seems like this device that could possibly do what we wanted it to do. But once you start digging into the details, you realize that they're not as reliable, just generally speaking, as you would think, in terms of enough control over the device, sending a notification at a particular time that you want to. Those kinds of things aren't that reliable. And then secondly, the actual sensors, a lot of the sensors have a lot of difficulties, specifically the heart rate sensor. And a lot of people don't know this, but it's not accurate below 20 beats per minute. And like most of them publish a range, like 20 beats per minute, 40 beats per minute. There's always this lower bound that they publish in terms of accuracy. And that is important for us, obviously, with Cryonics, because we're optimizing these devices for detecting the absence of a heart rate. And this becomes an issue. And I can get into more detail later on about why this sensor has that difficulty below 20 beats a minute. And you're not going to find that same kind of difficulty on, say, like a chest strap or something. It has to do with how the light-based sensor works on the wrist. This goes for anything that's using that type of light-based sensor. And so it also goes for blood oxygen levels, or you get blood pressure measured, heart rate, all the ones that are based on that heart rate sensor end up having that issue with accuracy below a certain range. So once I discovered that with the Apple Watch, and I figured that out by putting it on different things, trying to test the software that I had preliminary software. And I started noticing that it would measure these heart rates on inanimate objects. I was like, well, but if it was like a human wrist and someone had a pulse and then they didn't, surely it would detect that. And the answer is maybe, but we don't actually know. And it's not easy to test that, obviously. And there's reasons to believe that it still might read a heart rate on a person that has passed away. And so once I figured that out, I was discouraged in general. There's a couple other things about the Apple Watch that make it a very difficult device to work with for our purposes. The Apple Watch struggles a lot with battery life. It's one of the worst ones on the market. And so in order to deal with that, Apple throttles your app. Like if you're writing an app for the Apple Watch, even if you make a watch face app, which runs most of the time, they'll still give you as little resources as possible and try and stop your program from running. And if you're trying to be there at the moment of someone passing away and be sure that your app is going to run, you just can't be sure, and you're not going to get reliable runtime for it. So there's just so many other issues with the Apple Watch. One other important one I'll mention is wrist detection. So knowing whether the user is wearing the watch or not. So when you're not wearing your watch, you don't have a heart rate and you're not moving, which looks the same as if you've passed away. And so distinguishing between those two things and not having false positive alarms is difficult with the Apple Watch because they will not tell the developer if your user is wearing the watch. They don't want them knowing, and they say for security purposes. And Apple Watch wrist detection is very good. Their wrist detection is very good. They know very well if you're wearing it because there's Apple Pay and all these things connected to it. But you're not exposed to that interface as a developer. And so you don't know whether your user is wearing that watch or not. This is really just so many nails in the coffin of dealing with the Apple Watch. And I spent about 1 month doing a deep dive. I wrote up a prototype. It looked very nice. It said Cryonics alarm, and it looked like something you'd want to wear. But under the hood, it wasn't reliable. and had so many difficulties. So I moved on from there and started exploring subsequent devices, trying to find something that didn't have all these kinds of issues. And it was just one thing after another after that. And it's kind of, that's where I am today, although I have found something that I've looked at all the options and, kind of looked at all the trade-offs and found the best thing, which I'll go into in more detail later. But that's kind of like the framework that I'm dealing with. And that's kind of like my world is looking at those types of issues. What does this sensor do under that condition? Do I have access to this interface? Those are anytime I'm presented with a device that's a potential for our purposes, I understand that it's not meant for our purposes. It's meant for fitness tracking. It's meant for getting text messages. It's meant for looking cool. It's not necessarily going to do what we need it to do. And so I'm always asking, can I make it do what I need it to do? Do I have access to this? Can I get control over that? And I think when you go down this journey, you eventually get to the point of being like, well, I just need to build this from scratch. I just need to because these component parts are cheap. The technology can do everything we want it to do. Like we're well past that point of, we have been for 5 to 10 years, like having, really good wireless technology. And you could build this from scratch and make it very reliable. It's just with cryonics, you're dealing with 5,000 people total that are self-identified chronicists maybe that are signed up or in one or another. And it's just to take that undertaking from a financial standpoint starts to not make sense. So I'm trying to think a little bit more of the history that might be interesting. I joined the Alcor R&D committee, trying to giving them feedback on my research, which is mostly for a long time was disappointing and depressing. But as I said earlier, I recently converged on particular kind of solution and a particular device for now, just so that we could have something. And people want a device that goes off immediately. That's the ideal, is the moment that you pass away, because it's so important with standby to get there so quickly. But you have this issue, unattended death. Okay, now what happens? Someone comes over to your house. Oh, yes, they have passed away. Call the funeral director. They come. Maybe they do an autopsy. There's all these delays. Even if you have an alarm that goes off immediately, you still have all these issues. So you really do want to not add the delay of the alarm onto the pile of things that happen in unattended death. It'd be nice if it could happen immediately, but in order to get something reliable, I think on our first iteration, it's going to end up being something that goes off in like an hour, maybe an hour and a half, just to kind of optimize that intersection of not too many false positives, and then also just being sure, and not irritating the user too much, or false negatives, the other thing. But so yeah, I have converged on something in my own research that I'm currently in the process of building that would be reliable on the 1 hour to 1.5 hour time scale. And that is building it, looking at that heart rate sensor and, using it. But also, sorry, I have notifications, but also falling back on motion. Because I think the motion sensors, accelerometers, and gyroscopes are extremely reliable, even with small motion. Like I can differentiate like just small movements on the wrist from sensor noise. And so I can pick up small motions in sleep, and I can get, I'm basically looking at how often do you move, when do you move? And then I'm seeing, is there this gap for some period of time, and putting the alarm at that point. So this requires continuous access to some kind of motion sensor, like an accelerometer or gyroscope. I'm using both in this one because the device I'm using happens to have that. And yeah, the rest are implementation details. And yeah, I guess that's a good place to stop.
All right. Thank you very much for that overview. I have a few questions, and then we can go to questions from the panel and the audience, since this is a subject that has already raised considerable interest in the chat. So just for reference, I have a Fitbit Sense 2 on my left wrist and a Garmin Phoenix 5X on my right wrist, and I use both of them pretty much continuously throughout the day and the night. The only time I'm not wearing them is when I'm charging them, and that's usually for about 30 minutes every day. But I'm curious if you've had the opportunity to study those kinds of devices and compare their relative accuracy to that of the Apple Watch.
In terms of accuracy, um, I'm not sure because I started giving up on that heart rate sensor, like I said. Sorry, I don't know why this is still going. I started giving up on that heart rate sensor. But one thing to look at is whether or not it has FDA approval for a particular use case. And so, like the Apple Watch has FDA approval for atrial fibrillation, and so that's a good indicator of they're hitting certain accuracy standards. In terms of Fitbit Sense versus Garmin, from a Cryonics alarm standpoint, Fitbit Sense is well. The Garmin, when I looked at Garmin did not have a lot of features in their API for developers, in terms of like writing a watch face app that like you could run all the time and like have access to all the sensors and all. That's the kind of question that I'm looking at. Last time I looked at Garmin, the answer to a lot of those were no. Like, does it have wrist detection? Can I run it all the time? A lot of those answers ended up no. I ended up like going against that one from the beginning really easily. With Fitbit Sense 2, they haven't released the developer information for that yet. It's coming soon, and we have our fingers crossed because there's a lot of good things about that device, but we just don't know yet if we can use it. I'm part of the Fitbit developer community, and I'm bugging them about it all the time in their Discord. But I am building my solution around the Fitbit Sense 1, and so yeah, I'm really hoping that Fitbit Sense 2, we're going to be able to use that as well.
Very interesting. Thank you. Now, you mentioned there are issues with accurate detection of heart rates when they are low, and you mentioned for the Apple Watch, it's a threshold of about 20 beats per minute, which usually is indicative of some sort of problem. But if the heart rate is a bit higher, that's not necessarily indicative of a problem. So a lot of athletes, endurance athletes, undergo cardiac remodeling. And so their resting heart rates can be in the 40s, whereas for most people, the resting heart rates would be in the 60s or 70s. So when I'm asleep, for example, if my resting heart rate during the day is in the high 40s or low 50s, the heart rate when I'm sleeping could very well be in the low 40s or even high 30s, and that could be fine. So my question is a twofold. First of all, is there some error in the detection of that kind of heart rate when one is asleep, or is it still reasonably accurate? And second, is there any risk that a life monitoring device on people who are just really well-conditioned endurance athletes could generate false alarms at certain points in time when they're really relaxed and their heart is beating somewhat slowly?
Well, the lower bound is 20. So I'm gonna hope that 40 you're okay. I haven't actually tested it yet. My heart rate doesn't get that low. It gets to like 57 or something. So you're in a better situation than I am. But the solution that we're implementing, and that any solution I think that's reasonable, would have customizable components for that, so that the user could say, okay, don't do anything if my heart rate's 45. That's normal for me, but someone else might want to set that a bit higher. And that's one feature of the alarm, is a high and low heart rate, just to make that customizable so that you can avoid false positives that way.
Yes, indeed. And since you've had some experience with the Fitbit Sense 1, I'm wondering if it runs into an issue that I have observed when driving, because oddly enough, when I'm driving, of course, I'm seated, and usually when I'm seated, my heart rate would be somewhere between the high 40s and the 60s, depending on the situation. Now, driving can occasionally be stressful, but I've seen situations where either for a minute or even for a few minutes, the heart rate as read by the Fitbit Sense 2 spiked above 100. sometimes like into the 120s or 130s. And I've actually spoken to cardiologists about this. They think this may be some sort of artifact of the Fitbit device, but they're not experts in the device and perhaps in how the wrist moves when one is driving or when one is making sudden motions with the steering wheel. Do you think there's a possibility for that kind of error occurring on a fairly frequent basis?
Yeah, definitely. So I have gone into a little bit of detail on how the sensor processes the data. And the issue with this sensor is that it is extremely noisy. The data is extremely noisy. So if you look at it and you just look at the data, it looks worse than if you have audio file and you're looking at the sound and audio file. It just is a mess. It's a like the fact that they pull anything out of that, you're like, how the heck did they do that? They run various algorithms and different kinds of metrics over it to try and bring out this periodic regularity to discover that within this mess of data, because it's not just, I'll go into the other reasons it's messy, but motion is a big one. And since they are fitness trackers and they're trying to optimize for, that's what people want to use them for, they really really want to display a heart rate even when there's a lot of motion, because they're like, people want to look at this when they're exercising. And so the motion data, and I can point you to a place where you can actually look at this data, because some people, hacker types, have published streams of it just so you can see what it really looks like. Is The motion data is like creating these just huge interference, kind of imprints on this data, to where like you can't see anything that's underneath it. Like you just see like high and low, readings all over the place. And so people like Apple and Fitbit, they're like, well, people are exercising, they want to know what's going on. We're going to try really hard to find some regularity, some heart rate to publish, to the watch face, like in spite of this. And so it seems very likely that they're just getting it wrong. That like with all the kinds of computation that they're doing to try and discover this, periodic rhythm within it, they've just done too much to this data, and they've discovered the wrong number. The other kinds of interference are from, say, if you have like flickering light in the room, or if you have electrical interference, all these things interfere with the sensor. It depends how tight you're wearing it too. Like if you're like driving and it's like moving a little bit, or like the road is rumbling, you have to wear it reasonably tight, because you'll get interference that way as well. It's just very finicky sensor, and you work with it, you get really mad. It's not ideal.
Yes, it definitely is not ideal. Sometimes it has given me the occasion to perhaps worry unnecessarily. Now, I'm curious if there are periods of time when the data are so noisy, and I've actually seen this, for instance, when running, particularly when transitioning from one pace to another. The Fitbit sometimes displays just a blank entry for the heart rate. Like for a while, it doesn't detect anything, and eventually it calibrates and shows some sort of number. But of course, this could be a concern with a life monitoring device that sends an alarm too instantaneously. If someone is running and they're just accelerating and the watch is taking a little while to figure out what their heart rate is, but the life monitoring device doesn't detect a heart rate, you wouldn't want the alarm to be transmitted right away. You would want to give it a sizable amount of time to recalibrate.
Yeah. So there's a existing Cryonics alarm. I think it's just called Cryonics Alarm. It's by a developer called Gene Shaver. And he's converged on the same kind of thing. Like we think like 20 seconds. We think with Fitbit in particular, if you check if the user is moving, if you don't get any accelerometer data for 20 seconds, then the heart rate is probably the issue. Because yeah, the moving when you're exercising is what's causing that lack of heart rate.
Yes. And in terms of getting more of the detailed motion data or heart rate data, I've had some issues accessing that, even though from the Fitbit website, I can download all of the historical data ostensibly, but it's in a JSON file, and those are not really readily readable by laypersons. Is there some sort of service or platform that you're aware of that converts this to intelligible data for layperson users?
I'd have to look into it because they're going to have their own way of categorizing their motion data. So there, I don't think, and I've pulled the data from the Fitbit API before, like the web-based API, and I think it's already put into like it's not just the raw accelerometer data in which you're going to get a bunch of X, Y, Z numbers that aren't going to make any sense. I think they do categorize it somewhat. It's just yeah, it depends on their categories, but I'd have to look at it.
Yes, they do categorize it by type of data, certainly by heart rate, for instance. But when I open the file, it's still just a string of text and numbers, essentially, and it would have to be formatted in some way, at least in some sort of tabular format, to be really usable. But Jason uh, Geringer has made a post. Is anybody making other kinds of jewelry into Fitbit type monitors? He's thinking perhaps an earring or a pendant might work. I have a device called a Frontier X2, which is a heart rate monitor that is strapped onto the chest via essentially a strap with electrodes, and it can measure heart rate. It can also measure electrical heart strain and breathing rate, and it can generate a live ECG, including while one is exercising, which is quite useful. I'm not aware of any other device that does this. The only issue with it is there is an interpretation concern. So when it interprets the readout from the ECG, it categorizes the heart rhythm as either normal rhythm or so-called other rhythm. And other rhythm occurs some percentage of the time pretty much for everybody. Nobody's heart beats with perfect regularity or the standard shape of the sinus rhythm 100% of the time. So when one sees other rhythms, sometimes one wonders, well, is this a common benign type of arrhythmia, or is this something that one should be concerned about? So one still needs to send those ECG readings to a doctor to really know what's happening. But do you have any awareness of other kinds of devices besides devices that people wear on their wrists and their relative accuracy? So, for instance, do you think a chest strap kind of device is more accurate than a wrist based device?
Yeah, definitely. The chest strap ones are like on all the research that you can look at. The ECG on the chest is uh, much more accurate. And there have been cryonicists who have tried to build monitors around that. They've ended up coming into issues with the Bluetooth kept disconnecting and other kinds of hiccups. But in terms of having a more accurate measurement of heart rate, definitely. It comes down to this open question of you're going to build a solution, and if people don't wear it at all, then you're not helping them. Like your false negative rate, if someone doesn't wear it, is like 100%. So it's trying to like optimize, what this, I don't know, this kind of matrix looks like, but like you have to think, is it something someone's going to wear? Like if you're wearing a smartwatch, you're also getting your notifications, you're getting sleep tracking, you get all these other things that you want to wear anyway, and so maybe you'll be more likely to wear it. But yeah, I think a chest strap solution like has, lots of upsides. It's also bigger. Like once you can get into bigger devices, you can have bigger batteries, and battery life is always an issue with the wrist-based ones. Fitbit is the best, but the rest you're looking at like a day and a day and a half it's pretty terrible. In terms of other places to put the monitoring, I've seen people do like heart rate in the ear. The ear is a really good place where you can really see the blood vessels, I guess, with the light-based sensor. I've looked at, so I think like if you just wanted to go 100% motion, like you're just looking, is someone moving? You can put that a lot of places. You put it like you could wear a necklace. You could like clip it onto your belt. I experimented with one that was just an accelerometer. And I put it on a chest strap kind of thing to experiment. And I could actually see, the breathing waves of like, it was a very sensitive accelerometer, and I could actually pick up, I could see my breath on it, which was really exciting. So I was like, you could get an instant alarm if you did it this way, because it's very clear. This particular device had terrible Bluetooth. It was like a really old Bluetooth module, and it was like disconnecting all the time, like even when you're right beside it. And I was like, this is just gonna drive people nuts. But I think if you were like at the end of life and you're very serious about this, a chest strap is, you have a lot of upside with the chest strap. You could do the heart rate, and you could also do the breathing motion. And then you have those two things. You're very unlikely to get a false negative in that situation.
Yes, indeed. And as you explained, the greatest issue with the chest straps would be people's motivation to wear them continuously, because I know that after I've worn one for an hour or more when exercising, I definitely do not feel like wearing it for the rest of the day. I would rather, if I do wear something to continuously track my heart rate, wear something on my wrist or something else that's convenient, but I would want to essentially not feel like it's any sort of extra discomfort as I go about my day to day activities. Of course, I'm not in a position where I'm worried about sudden death for any reason. So people who are might have a different set of considerations. Now, Ben Ballweg has a question for you. So, Ben, please proceed.
Thanks for coming today, Nikki. When I heard that you were coming and what you were going to be talking to us, I had worked with EMS for a while, and EMS is ambulance services for districts, and I'm pretty sure that they cover the U.S. as a whole. That every citizen is within an EMS district. I could say maybe not all of Alaska or something, but in general, most of the U.S. is covered by EMS districts. And I kind of wondered, maybe if people were willing to all wear monitoring devices like this and have the government know what their heart rate was at all given times, like they could cross from one district to another, and if an EMS district saw someone was in their district and that their heart rate was dropping below a threshold level, that they could be like, we need to get, like, the alarm would sound and they would get to that person without needing someone to recognize that that person was in trouble and to call 911 for that. There would be the whole needing people to be okay with letting the government know that all that biomedical information about them. But I wondered if this technology was maybe already almost at this point that we could have people sign up for biotracking to this degree, that if they were crashing, if like a code blue would have been called on them had they been in the hospital, if ambulances would immediately be dispatched for similar situations, not just those that had signed up for a cryonic service, but any citizen of the U.S. that was within an EMS district.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely sounds like it works for us really well. What you're describing reminds me a lot of a company called BioBeat, which they're based in Israel, and they have the most impressive wrist-based device that I've seen. They actually outperform the Apple Watch. They have FDA approval for a lot of other measurements that the Apple Watch doesn't have. For instance, they have FDA approval for doing blood pressure on the wrist, which is, you know, difficult. It's that light-based sensor again, and they have a couple other things that they don't have FDA approval for. But in any case, they are intended for when you have a patient that's in the hospital, but then they don't really need to be in the hospital, but they're not stable yet. Like you're going to send them home, but like stuff could go wrong. And so you send them home with the BioBeat watch, and then they're tracking all those metrics. There's like 8 or 10 different metrics that they're tracking. And then they also have this machine learning AI system that they've built that gives the patient what's called an early warning score that's supposed to be really good at detecting decline early on, so that you can bring them back to the hospital and you can, you know, potentially save their life. And they have FDA approval for that. And so it's this like really impressive device. The issue is that, I mean, the FDA gets in the way with a lot of things, but they did get FDA approval for it, but they have to draw these boundaries and say, this is only for like, you know, stable patients. It's not for like extremely critically ill patients. This isn't a life-saving device for emergent. Like they have all these, if you go to the website and you read the red tape kind of statements that they make, because there are still these errors and difficulties with these devices that they can't make those kinds of claims because they don't want to be liable for someone died, like, and it was our watch that was failing. But so I was in contact with BioBeat. I wanted to adopt their system for the Cryonics alarm because we want standby there. We don't want to have unattended death. So if we could get an early warning score and be like, you know, something's going wrong, that'd be like way better. And especially if it's accurate, then we're not flying standby team out for no reason. So I got into communication with them. Because of the nature of like the legalities around it, they can't sell the device to individual people, like to individual developers. You can't just have their device. They have to sell it to a medical institution that like you have to describe your workflow. What are your nurses doing? When are they checking the dashboard? Like who's the doctor? Like they ask all these questions. So it's intended for a medical setting. Just kind of helps their liability probably some way too. But I managed to like convince them, like, well, you know, Alcor is a medical facility. It's a 501c3 research, you know, scientific organization. There's a nurse, like there's the standby, or there's the point of contact there, the nurse. So they got interested. They said, okay, maybe your use case, maybe we can do that. So I ended up asking them more questions. And it just turned out their estimate was very high. Like they want to sell to like a whole hospital, like that has, you know, thousands of patients. Like there's no easy way to onboard with them. And furthermore, like they don't have that alerting system in place for our purpose. Like it's not calling anyone. It's meant for a nurse who's sitting at a station who's going to like periodically check this, not for like sudden emergencies. So it wasn't exactly fit for our purpose. It would take some development work on top of their existing. I cleared it with them. I said, can I develop on top of it this way? Can I get access to this data? They're like, yes, no problem. So I was very excited about it as a potential, you know, solution. And in terms of whether anything will get like good enough so that someone would sign off on it, like, yes, this is, because they won't sign off on saying this is for emergencies, this is for, you know, critically ill patients. I don't know. I don't know if we'll get there on the wrist anyway, but yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you. Now let us go to Dan Elton, our Director of Scholarship, to see if he has any questions or comments.
Okay. Yeah. Hi. I thought it was really interesting. You talked about how the Apple Watch is really noisy, and that's the experience I had as well with my Garmin's. And I've also noticed that with the sleep tracking that it's not very accurate. So personally, I have given up heart rate monitoring and most sleep tracking because I find it can be very anxiety provoking. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the issues you've seen with the heart rate monitoring, and I was wondering if it can sometimes like overshoot, like if say you're there's you know, some people worry like when they're getting out of bed or going up the stairs, their heart rate is going too high. And I was wondering if maybe sometimes actually what's happening is like there's just an artifact in the monitoring.
Yeah, I don't know because I haven't used that. I haven't really looked at it for that purpose. But I can say that I've noticed that for myself as well. And the Aura ring sometimes tells me like your heart rate's like 120 just from standing up. And I'm like, do I have like this postural hypertension, or is it just a crappy device? Or
Yeah, and I worry that some of these people who have long COVID or POTS maybe doing themselves a disservice by obsessively monitoring. I mean, I had essentially long COVID-like syndrome for about 5 months, and I found that heart rate monitoring and sleep tracking it wasn't helpful. So, the other thing I wanted to mention is that I was wondering if you could tell us more about blood pressure monitoring, because one thing I've heard is that if there was a way to reliably monitor blood pressure, then a lot of cases of heart failure might be prevented, because there's a very reliable risk factor for heart failure, which is when your blood pressure gets really, really, really high. And so some people have said that if you could monitor blood pressure and if you see it like going up, then you could actually treat people before they get heart failure. So I was wondering, but then I was talking with another guy last week, and he said like there's actually no good hardware for this. Like, so I was wondering if you learned anything about that.
So for cryonics monitoring, we obviously don't want to be using the traditional blood pressure, right? Like where it inflates, because there are ones for the wrist like that too. And it's like, well, you don't want that happening while you're sleeping. You'll just wake up every time it takes a measurement. So the question is whether or not there's a light-based or some other mechanism. But in this case, the light-based is the one that I've looked at, and that's that BioBeat company. They are doing that. They have FDA approval for accuracy of blood pressure on the wrist. And so I'd love to get that and start experimenting with it, because not only to, I think maybe the early warning score has that factored in the ways that you're saying, maybe it's detecting something, you're going to have a stroke in 3 days and your blood pressure starts to get weird, way that you could measure, especially like with machine learning and all that you could pick up on. But I also just want to get these things and then put them on inanimate objects, because there's this question of like what happens below a certain threshold, 20 beats per minute, for instance, like where in that case, the signal to noise ratio of the data just gets, it overwhelms the device. The interference from, movement artifacts and, light in the room, electrical interference, that dominates the data. And because you just have this slow heart rate, it's hard to detect the beat in there. So I don't know what blood pressure does. I don't know what the blood pressure mechanism like looks like in that context, like how they're measuring it, like what the data processing is, and if it's messed up at below 20 beats a minute the same way that the heart rate is. I imagine so, because your blood pressure is related to your heartbeat. But I want to get it and put it on the things that I put it on, which is, people have seen my other content. I put it on chicken drumsticks, because like raw chicken drumsticks, because they have like, there's skin, there's like muscle, there's tendon, there's bone, there's all the kinds of things that like the light is going to hit that look similar to a human wrist. So I put things on that and I see like, can you tell that this doesn't have a heart rate? And like most of the time, the answer is no. So yeah, if I could get access to one of these.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see that if you've published that anywhere. It's really funny.
Yeah, I
Um,
do. Yeah, I can share a link, but yeah, I have one with all the different devices, all of them finding a heart rate. Even the Apple Watch, it's two different versions of, like, it's the same hardware, 'cause it's like the Apple Watch 6 in both cases, just different case. And then it's different versions of the software. It's like 7.1 versus 7.3 or something. Same chicken kind of thing, same tightness, like same watch rung, same light, exact same room, same sounds. Everything's the same except for the software version. And they're reading like wildly different heart rates on this like inanimate chicken. It's like, what a catastrophe. Like, you guys are failing so bad.
It's probably because, like you said, they're using machine learning algorithm, and you're going like out of distribution. So it's operating in data that it's in a regime that it wasn't really trained for.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's really funny.
Yes.
I feel like something similar happens with sleep trackers also. Like I've noticed, if I'm taking a medication or something that might interfere with my sleep, I seem to notice that the sleep trackers become less accurate. So like it will say, for instance, I was awake for 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the night, and I'm pretty sure I wasn't actually awake. And I have a theory that that's because they're really just trained on like, normal patients or something. But anyway, yeah.
Yes, and I wonder how much extrapolation from prior readings is being used in some of those cases. Like, if it registers a heart rate for whatever reason, is there an algorithm that says, well, this heart rate isn't going to come down to zero all of a sudden, or it's not going to come down by 60 beats per minute? So let's say it does experience some sort of artifact and the heart rate spikes to say 130 when it should be around 50 or 60. Is there an algorithm that says, well, it's not going to be 50 or 60 right away after being 130, so we'll project some sort of gradual path for it to come down? And that's how you could have periods where the heart rate reading is abnormally high for a few minutes, even though the actual heart rate may not be that high.
Yeah, and this is a really good example of, like, from an engineering standpoint, from a software development standpoint, you want to be able to test your solution, and you want to, like, if I test my solution on 7.1 and then Apple does this update to the software of the processing of the sensor, and suddenly it's behaving differently in a meaningful way. I mean, I'm dealing with a black box. I don't know why it's doing what it's doing. I don't know that it's going to keep doing that. I can't build a solution around this, like, unless you have actual access to the raw data, which a lot of them won't give you, for battery life reasons. So yeah, it just, you end up in this direction of, I want to build this from scratch because I want to be the one that takes this data and adapts like the behavior to my particular use case, not to exercise or whatever it is.
Yes. Yes, I do think that is important to consider the use case and the applications of the device when developing a solution. Art, Ramon, do you have any questions?
Yeah, just a comment. Right now, I am wearing a medical grade heart monitor. And this is because I have a heart issue thanks to COVID. But this thing has a sensor, which is here. I have to charge this thing like every 3 days. And then the rest of it, this is the sensor. The monitor is basically a phone. And I have to charge this. I'll take that back. I charge this every 3 days. This every 4 days. And it's quite inconvenient because it's basically a cell phone with an app. It doesn't give me any metrics, just my doctor sees those metrics. And you have to change out these patches on your chest every 4 days. But I think this is probably what you would need to even get to the realm of monitoring a patient for cryonics, to get them to cryonics, to get something medical grade. But it's just not there yet to have something that's carefree. I mean, it's just very very cumbersome. These two devices with a monitor, which is a phone, basically connects to the Verizon network, and the sensor, which requires a very itchy patch. Some people are allergic to the glue on this patch. To me, it's kind of itchy, so it actually keeps me up at night sometimes because it's bothering me. But then you can't scratch. So, but I think this is where you need to go, probably in this direction, and maybe try and make this a better product somehow. This is Phillips right there. So,
Yeah. Well, the question is, so your doctor reviews it like once a day, or how often do they look at it?
I don't know how often they look at it, but it's going to monitor me for 30 days.
Oh, okay.
Those 30
Yeah.
days of monitoring.
So it's probably Bluetooth, and it's probably syncing at some like
Yes.
interval to save like battery life. Yeah.
Yeah, between this is Bluetooth, but then to send to my doctor or the service is Verizon,
Internet.
cellular network.
Yeah. So there's a question there of like, how often does it actually sync the data? Because if the data is stuck on the device, like we don't know about it.
Yeah, if you keep it too far from the sensor, it will disconnect the Bluetooth, and that could take a while. But I pretty much keep it near me at all times. But yeah, I mean, and this is a two-part system. It's not one self-contained device. And but somehow if you could merge this with the sensor and make it so you don't have to freaking charge it, so often, is probably the direction you would need to go to really get a reliable service for, cryonics, emergency alert.
Yeah, well, some people also just want it as an implant, and I know that's like many years away, and it's expensive with the FDA. But then you don't have to, because the only one that I wear on a regular basis is the Aura Ring. And like I have like 10 of these things around. And I like, it starts out with high hopes. Like I'm going to wear this. And then it just doesn't happen. The only one that I've tolerated is the Aura Ring. But if you could put the sensor inside, like once every 3 years or something, and then it would be like way easier. Yeah.
Yeah. There's actually a type of battery, which is called the beta cell or beta voltaic battery, that was developed in the 1960s, and it uses a tiny amount of radioactive material to generate a small amount of electricity. And that sort of battery was actually tested, I think, for pacemakers, and it basically will last years and years and years. And it's actually extremely safe because the radioactive material is embedded within a solid state device, and it's and the amount of radiation it's producing is minuscule, and it's not really leaking out as far as I understand. So, I've been wondering, like, when are we going to start developing these beta cell batteries again? It seems like progress on that has kind of stalled, possibly due to misguided concerns about radioactivity. But because that would be amazing if you could have a implanted device that would last a decade or basically indefinitely, and run out without having to be recharged. Or and also there was another idea to use like the acidity of blood to power such a device. I'm not sure where that technology is, but I'm curious if you have any ideas about implanted devices. Another thing I came across recently is there's a company which is called Inner Cosmos, and they want to implant a small, like coin-sized device in the skull to do AC current stimulation. So it's not really related that much, but it kind of shows like there seems to be advantages to implanting things.
Actually, in cryonics, there's a new company called Cryopets, which is it's founded by someone who loves pets and wants to do cryopreservation for pets. But they also see the way in which this could actually be a gateway to wider cryonics adoption, just because people love their pets, people spend a lot of money on their pets, and if it was marketed in the right way, it might, be a really positive thing. But the other aspect is that you can do research on pets a lot easier because you don't have certain kinds of hurdles. And so you can refine the cryopreservation process with research on animals and pets. So it's an upside from that as well. I was thinking, how could that kind of line of thinking apply to cryonics monitoring? Like, is there any way that I could use pets or animals to further this? And it did come up, like, this idea of implants, because doing an implant with humans is a hugely expensive, like, medical undertaking. Like, the company would have to have millions and millions of dollars, and you have 5,000 cryonicists. Like, you're never going to get the return on that investment unless it was generally useful for everyone, not just useful for cryonics. But what about this idea of doing an implant for pets? And you already have implants for pets because you're doing the microchipping. And so what if instead of just the microchip, you implant something that did other stuff, and you kind of experiment with, making a cryonics alarm, or just a very simple implant that did very, like, basic stuff and transmitted the data to the user's phone. I thought, like, that could be, one way to go. But so I looked into that with a friend of mine and discovered that, so the size that you need to, like, get to do the microchipping has to be smaller than a certain amount so that it can be done with this needle, certain gauge of a needle, instead of a surgery. Because if you're going to require surgery, then it's going to be a tougher sell. Because you go to the vet, oh, do you want to give a surgery, or just this? People are going to choose the thing that's, like, less invasive and easier and cheaper. And if you do, the needle size, you have a certain amount of space. The sensors are small. Like, you can do amazing stuff with small, tiny sensors. You could even charge it, charge it from outside the body. In a pet's case, maybe you have a collar that communicates with it. So you can do, like, an inductive charging, but the sensors are not small enough yet in order to get it into that size that you need to get it in the needle. But there are, like, research papers on this thing, like, of making tiny heart rate sensor or blood pressure sensor that is in a little glass capsule that goes into the body. And then it's like, people have been saying in cryonics, oh, cryonics monitoring is just around the corner. And I don't want to say that, but when you start looking at the researchers, oh yeah, this is happening. They are making progress. There are these things that we could do. And I think, yeah, pursuing the pet route first as a way to test this for our particular use case might make sense.
Yes, indeed. And actually, we had Kai Micah Mills of CryoPets as our guest for our virtual Enlightenment Salon in June of 2022. I have posted a link to it here. And as I understand it, he has a facility now set up to do pet cryopreservations. So he is definitely making progress. Now, I also wanted to say, Art Ramon, I know a lot about the MCOT Philips Biotel monitor because I also wore it for 30 days. And the reason why I wore that monitor, and by the way, everything you stated about the inconveniences accompanying it is completely true. And it was a really frustrating period of time for me when I was dealing with those inconveniences. But the reason why I wore that monitor was because I also suffered from long COVID. And in October of last year, this Fitbit Sense 2 watch gave me 5 readings for atrial fibrillation, except they weren't the alerts that would come by default from the Fitbit. They were the result of me using the manual ECG app where I would have to sit still for 30 seconds and press my fingers to the corners of the device. And that was really strange because while atrial fibrillation is a consequence of certain cases of COVID, most often it happens with very severe COVID, and my case was not severe. Moreover, in the general population, atrial fibrillation happens to about 11% of people over the age of 80. So this sent me into a kind of medical emergency mode where I tried to do everything possible to really diagnose what was happening with me. And I ended up wearing a Holter monitor for 5 days. And then I spoke with the cardiologist after it failed to detect any atrial fibrillation over that 5 day period. And he said, well, let's get you set up with this for a 30-day period and really try to rule it out. And the other option that was suggested to me, which is germane to the conversation, was what is called an implantable loop recorder, which is a small device that would get medically implanted into the chest for a year, and it would give continuous readings. It wouldn't involve any of the inconveniences associated with the patches, but of course, it would have the downside of any possible side effects associated with the implantation. It would be a much more invasive procedure than wearing the patches. So I wore the patches for 30 days, and I would say the most inconvenient thing about them is the patches can detach sometimes spontaneously, even if one is not engaged in physical activity. And the result was no atrial fibrillation was detected. So most likely the watch gave me false alarms, and here is why. Because when one keeps one's hand still, it's not exactly still, especially when one is pressing with the fingers, there's a bit of wobbliness. And that wobbliness definitely shows up on the heart rhythm reading. So normally in between beats, there's a kind of fairly flat and smooth baseline. But with the manual ECG app, the baseline is wobbly as well. And it can obstruct the P wave at the beginning of each beat. So sometimes you could have a benign arrhythmia. It's called sinus arrhythmia. And generally, athletes will actually have more of it, where the beats are irregularly spaced apart, but they're of a normal shape. Except if the ECG app sees the baseline as wobbly, it could obstruct the P wave. And the absence of a P wave is one of the signs that it uses to detect atrial fibrillation. So essentially, my watch gave me some serious false alarms that set me on this medical journey that ended up lasting a few months. Fortunately, I don't have any damage to the tissues of the heart. I had a cardiac MRI to rule that out. But it is an example of a situation where sometimes you can get false positives and they're treated very seriously within the medical system. And you can get a lot of real accurate information from that medical journey, but you have to undertake a medical journey for a few months. And it takes time and money, and it involves a lot of uncertainty in the meantime. So I'm curious if there could be a more accurate solution for people, which provides an appropriate balance of giving good and detailed information and not giving false positives or causes for alarm. I know you've been working with the Fitbit Sense 1, and what have been your impressions regarding that device generally as it compares to the others?
Well, from a developer standpoint, it's amazing. They let you run your app all the time. You get access to all the sensors. You get to transmit your data reasonably frequently enough, to go from the watch to the phone. You have a raw accelerometer stream, a raw gyroscope. You can find fine motion details and the rest. The heart rate sensor, it gets bad ratings compared to the others. If you look at, you can find out there, PubMed articles that compare the different ones and see how they all stack up. Fitbit is kind of the cheaper, kind of just less medically exciting device, but they do have things that the other ones don't have. So the Fitbit Sense 1 you can measure electrodermal activity, like basically how the lie detectors work. It's looking at, when you're changing your sweat glands, changes like the conductivity of your skin. And so it's measuring, it's a proxy for nervous system activity. So you can take that measurement with the Fitbit Sense 1, but not passively. Like you have to actively be like, I'm taking this measurement, just like the ECG, and you have to be involved in it. It won't work for cryonics monitoring because we need to measure passively. But the Fitbit Sense 2 has that passively. I think it's measuring that in an ongoing way, and then telling you your stress levels. I don't have a Fitbit Sense 2 yet. I would like to try it because I'm like not the most relaxed person, so I'd be interested if it'd be helpful for me. But I would love to get access to that sensor because I don't know how it could mess up in the case of death. I don't know what your sweat glands do. I don't know enough about how that actually works for the body. And I do end up running into those kinds of barriers sometimes. If you Google, like, what does a lie detector read on a dead person? It's like, no one has answered that question. No one cares. And so I have to get these things and put them on things and to solve this question. I think that might be a promising sensor. And there are some devices that have that. The Fitbit Sense 2, Google like acquired Fitbit. They're like behind on things. There's confusion about what they're going to do. They're promoting their Pixel Watch over the Fitbit. I don't know what's going to happen in terms of access to that data for the Fitbit Sense 2. We just have our fingers crossed and that's it. But so there are like definite upsides to Fitbit Sense, definitely over the Apple Watch. But the heart rate aspect, I have the impression that that's less accurate. What I can do with it, though, is I can still do high and low heart rate. Does your heart rate go below 40 beats per minute or above 200? Okay, maybe there's a problem that we're interested in. And I can also do, is there no heart rate? Because I've studied with the Fitbit Sense and I've done a lot of experimentations with the raw chicken, unfortunately. Like I spent all of like June or July last year, like, and I do have video footage of it because it's just really funny. But putting it on and then seeing how long it takes for it, because when you first put it on, it's like, 75 beats per minute, 106, like just in the normal human range. It's like, okay, whatever. But after some period of time, it does get it right. It eventually decides there's no heart rate. And it's even for a moment of time, then it'll go back to finding heart rate. But if you can pick up that moment of time. So I did do a lot of experiments with it, and it does eventually give up. Like eventually, so, and Gene Shaver, who I mentioned earlier, he has a Fitbit Sense solution, Cryonics Alarm available. He also did this experimentation, I think, on chicken breast instead of chicken drumstick, but like I chose for the skin of the, it's weird that this is what you do with your time, but he ended up finding that like there's several aspects here. So how long did the person wear it with a heart rate first before transferring it onto the inanimate object? That makes a difference because it is looking at historical data, like this is what it expects, and then it sees a sudden change. All of a sudden there's noise and some weird stuff's happening. It like gives up and says there's no heart rate. It thinks it's on a counter or something. Versus if I just put it on after I haven't been wearing it, like I put it on the chicken, it takes it longer to give up. And so there's some reason to think that, okay, it'd probably figure it out that there's no heart rate in some amount of time, maybe under like a half an hour. But yeah, we don't know, unfortunately. And we're just doing all these experiments with chicken. So, yeah.
Yes. Well, we would be happy to see more information about your experiments with chicken legs. So I would be happy to share a link if you provide it. We have a comment from Edward Hudgens who writes, that he has a Fitbit Sense 1, and he thinks it's great. Wearables are central to moving from a sick care to a healthcare, health span, and longevity system. And he thinks Apple is positioning itself to be a major healthcare player. So Edward is one of the people who is satisfied with the tracking abilities of the Fitbit Sense 1. Now, we have some interesting audience questions as well. And these questions pertain to some of the software applications that may be available right now. So Rudy Hoffman is wondering about a current software app that Cryonics Institute has that requires a periodic response, or they scramble a team or call you. Are you aware of how that works and what sort of tracking technology, if any, it uses other than just an affirmative check-in by the individual?
Yeah, so it doesn't use any wearables. It's a mobile app that is basically just a timer, and you can set that timer frequency, as I understand, how often you want. So it can check on you every hour, Like, something goes off, are you okay? If not, start calling the contacts. Or, 24 hours. I don't know what the maximum is they have as an option there, but the issue with that obviously is that like you don't want it to check on you every hour, every half an hour. Like you're going to stop using it. It's going to be too annoying. So yeah, you need to start bringing in the sensor data so that you don't have to be involved. You don't want to have to do anything with it. Hopefully just you start and stop it. And that's it.
Yes. So it is essentially perhaps an earlier generation of technology that is being used here that doesn't really rely on wearable devices or continuous sensors, but it does rely on the members essentially taking an active role and checking in. And I can see how that would have been the state of the art even, say, half a decade ago. Now, it's also interesting that Rudy Hoffman has some experience with these kinds of devices. So he says, all of us have said and heard, oh, Jesus, a life monitoring watch is no big deal until we find that it really is. And he has an Apple 4 watch, which has functionality to call if his heart glitches. And he notes that the I have fallen function on this watch actually does work, but as you pointed out, Nikki, perhaps the heart glitch function is not as reliable as might be advertised. And T. Theodorus Ibrahim asks, does a potential partial solution involve multiple systems working together, which all need to give a positive result before an alarm is sounded? So do you think maybe to overcome some of these issues in particular devices, one solution might be to have multiple wearables, perhaps configured in multiple ways in multiple places, so you could have a wrist-based wearable and something in your ear simultaneously, and they both have to agree before there's some sort of alarm.
Yeah, definitely. You can also start adding in other things that you probably haven't thought of. Like people do like infrared cameras that they point at people's beds to see if they're breathing. Like machine learning can figure out like breathing and like body temperature. Body temperature is an interesting one for us because the body temperature doesn't drop fast enough. Like it drops about 1 degree per minute. And so, or sorry, 1 degree per hour. And that's like if you're just at room temperature, like if you're under the covers, it might be even slower. So that's just not fast enough for us. But like, I think like at the root of, so you have to have like our system is, we're putting motion at the base level and saying, these other sensors are less trustworthy. Motion is the most trustworthy sensor. And so if there's no motion for a long period of time, there's probably an issue. We can think of some interfering factors, like you have a pet that jumps around in the bed, or like if you're not living alone and you have a spouse, they really roll over in the bed. There's ways that it could go wrong, but we think that motion is kind of like the most reliable sensor to deal with. But yeah, I think there's also something that Ben Best found that like plugs into the wall that like listens for noise in the room and like vibrations in the room. It's like for seniors living alone, and it figures out if you have normal activity. Like, did you go in the kitchen 4 times a day at the regular times that you usually go in the kitchen? And so you start bringing all these together and you think, I'm definitely not going to have any false negatives. It's just a question of how quickly can I get that alarm to sound? Because if some of these are like, it's going to be an hour, it's going to be whatever, we want something that happens like as soon as possible. And so that's like the holy grail, is not just like no false negatives, but like quick at the same time.
Yes, thank you very much, Nikki. And there's another question from Rudy Hoffman. He would be interested in the experience that you have had working with Alcor as a volunteer.
Oh, it's been great. It's been really interesting to sit in on those meetings. It's basically other science and technology related research that Alcor does. Has almost nothing to do with the wearable stuff, most of the time I give presentations there periodically on my updates, but I get to hear all the other stuff that they're doing. Is bound by an NDA, so I can't really talk a lot about it, but it is really interesting.
All right. And then we have another question from Luis Arroyo. With cryonics in mind, any thoughts on the recent proposal to get prisoners to be organ donors in return for shorter prison sentences instead of, say, a more dignified path like cryonics or a burial? Well, it would seem to me that there is a bit of a conflict between being a cryonicist and being an organ donor for obvious reasons. You want your body intact after legal death if there's a chance for it to be revived. But on the other hand, I'm not aware of many prisoners who are signed up for cryonics. Generally, that's not really two overlapping populations that are under consideration. So what do you think of this? And do you think there's ever a possibility that cryonics might become one of the more accepted default options, that funeral homes might, for instance, offer a choice of burial, cremation, or cryonics instead of cryonics being perceived as something that is, let's say, outside of the mainstream, and perhaps those prisoners who agree to be organ donors don't even know that cryonics exists?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's another reason why pet cryonics makes more sense, is that it's easier to study cryonics with being able to do pet euthanasia. But I know in Alcor's case and other cases where they try and get body donations, first of all, it's expensive. And second of all, people don't want to do it. Well, they don't believe in cryonics in the first place. They don't think they're doing it because they're going to come back. But like, they want to donate to like a noble cause. Like they want to say, I want to be part of the cure for cancer or Alzheimer's, often what they died for, like a family member died from. And so, yeah, I just don't think there's a lot of interest there. In terms of merging like cryonics with funeral, like if a funeral home offered cryonics as another option, I think that would be awesome. Like it just, and we've actually talked about, my friend Carrie and I, Carrie Radomski, about actually going to funeral director conferences, of which there's like every year there's like a big one for like the association in Canada and the big one for the association in the United States, and setting up a booth there and just an educational booth and like explaining cryonics, because I actually think like funeral directors are like kind of weird people and they'd probably find cryonics interesting. And if someone could find a business angle to like bring the two together, like if it just took one person who would got kind of inspired by that, that could be really good for the popularity of cryonics.
Ben Ballweg wrote in our internal chat that reminds him of some of the protests that Carl Carlisle, who is a life extension activist who was quite active in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, he was advocating for protests against death at funeral homes, but of course, with a constructive motive to get them to adopt cryonics as an option. So I wish you the best of luck. I'm definitely not the kind of person who would go anywhere near a funeral director conference, but we need people who would. So I hope that you're able to engage in some dialogue with at least a few funeral directors who might be sympathetic if the finances of the arrangement makes sense. I don't see why they wouldn't offer it, even if it costs a little bit more than a conventional funeral. I think a fair number of people would be interested.
Yeah, they don't want to be sending their customers away, right? They don't want to be saying, oh, there's this other option, and then you go pay those people, unless maybe they got some commission from that. So I'm trying to think of like a business angle for them that would make sense, because cryonics is all about, there's no resources, there's no funding, there's no customers. So it's really hard to do things without the financial incentive.
Right. And this is why it would be useful to scale up the practice of cryonics and enable it to be available in more venues, and that way one could attract the interest and the funding and have more constituencies invested in making it successful. Jason Geringer wonders, is there a big market for Fitbit type monitors for children? Because he thinks maybe some people would buy these devices for their kids before even themselves, maybe if they're concerned about their kids getting enough physical activity and they want to monitor that. What do you think about that possibility?
I have seen those devices on the market. They're like simplified versions of the devices that we're familiar with. They have like 2 buttons, they're like brightly colored, and they do similar stuff. So yeah, that exists. I don't know how popular it is, but I don't know that they would be any more suited to our purpose unless just by accident. Sometimes people just put the device together with all the features we want by accident, just because they weren't. That's just what they did. They gave us all the data, they gave us all the access to it, but yeah, not that I'm aware of for our purposes.
Yes, thank you. And go ahead, Jason.
Well, I'm also kind of curious, if I can, what are the rules with like cryonics and kids? I mean, can you sign your kids up for cryonics? And because I mean, I know the rules are like different when it, when parents have like certain, they can like make a kid wear his hat if they want. You know what I mean? So I'm wondering what are the, I know that's a touchy subject, but are there what are the rules on that? I mean,
I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
There are kids who have been cryopreserved. I know of at least one case. There was actually a documentary about it a few years ago, which also featured another former guest of ours from a virtual Enlightenment Salon in 2020, Dr. Robert McIntyre. But essentially, the documentary was about a family in Thailand that actually went to the United States. Their daughter had a terminal illness, a young child, and they had her cryopreserved at Alcor. So I will find the name of the documentary shortly, but it was indeed quite interesting. Now we have a comment from Ampero, who writes, the real problem is that we cannot check our health metrics as quickly and easily as we check texts or emails. Imagine if you could detect the formation of cancer at T0, so right when it was formed. Actually, there is a company that seeks to achieve something of this sort. It is called SAR Labs, TZAR, and I met with one of the spokesman for it, Ashish Tripathi, at RadFest 2022 in San Diego. SAR Labs offers a blood test that they are rolling out, I believe, in India and the United Kingdom, and at some point later in the United States, where for a few $100s, you could get a test to determine whether or not you have either early stage cancer or a precursor to early stage cancer, so a condition that may become cancerous within a year. And that test could also tell you if you're not going to get cancer within the next year. So imagine the kind of peace of mind that it would give to people to have a clear negative result for cancer. So these kinds of advances are beginning to be made, but that was an astute observation from Ampero. Now, I am curious, Jason, if you have any further questions or comments for Nikki.
I do kind of want to mention, Art just mentioned in there, but Captain Picard was still bald. That's just weird. I don't know. It just coming to my head. If they really got like, genetic engineering and stuff, how come Captain Picard was bald? Does he really want to be bald? I don't know. That's a anyway. Here's a weird question. For context, we asked someone else the same question and it was very interesting, the answer we got, because it led down into this thing about whether or not Nickelodeon is actually like not good for kids. But what cartoons did you watch when you was little? That's my weird question for the day.
Watched Care Bears. I just think, how little are we talking about? Like the earliest memories, or
Whenever. What was your favorite?
favorite thing? I remember liking Care Bears. I remember liking Inspector Gadget, which, yeah, that's kind of interesting, I guess, now. And eventually I latched on to, like, so my mom told me that, like, she couldn't get my sister and I to sit still. Like, she tried to play us all the Disney movies and stuff, and we just wouldn't watch them. So I actually haven't seen like most of the Disney movies. I watched them in adulthood, and I don't know what that is, because like I don't have that problem now, so I don't know what that was about when I was young. But yeah, what else did I watch? That's all. I can't. I'm like totally blanking on it. I can't remember.
Well, for context, when we asked the other guy, he come up and he was like, he watched Looney Tunes, and then he said, I can't remember his name, but he was a really cool guy. But he said, I've come to realize that all my friends that watched Nickelodeon are like all depressed now and stuff. I just thought it was a really weird data point, but okay.
Yeah,
Back
there's
to you.
some shows. There's some. Go ahead. There's some shows that I watch now that I watched when I was young, and I was like, what? Like, this is dark, or it's weird, like really weird. Like, I really like, yeah, here's one. I really like Charlie Brown and Snoopy stuff. Like, I watched all of the seasonal ones, Charlie Brown Christmas, like Easter Beagle, like all of them. And then like the regular show. And I watch it now, and it's like these people are like on drugs. It's like they're going on these drug trips. Like all of this stuff is like psychedelic imagery. And it's like really cool. I just like washed over you as a kid that you didn't know kind of the associations, but it just like looked cool. So yeah, that actually, yeah, that was my favorite one, I guess. I didn't watch it all the time, but I liked it the most. So yeah.
Interesting. So speaking of films, the name of the documentary that I mentioned previously, and it can be found on Netflix, is Hope Frozen. It was made in 2018. Ampero also writes that the television show Picket Fences had an episode called Frosted Flakes, which aired on May 6, 1994. It concerned a child dying from leukemia, and his parents wanted to cryonically freeze him. So there is certainly an interest in that among parents of terminally ill children. And yes, that's essentially the only chance many of these children would get given today's state of medical care, unfortunately. Edward Hudgens writes that he has looked at the watches for his 12-year-old twins and also to keep in touch. He thinks that the Apple Watches are overall best, but also very costly, and the sub-Fitbit types of watches get poor ratings for many features. So there is also an interest in fitness tracking for children, including by the parents of those children. So now I am curious. We have Dr. Jose Cordero on as one of our panelists. Jose, do you want to ask any question or make any comment?
Woo.
Well, hello. It is good to be here and mostly listening, but since you want me to ask something, yes, Nikki, how do you see these wearables evolving in the next 5 years, especially adding capabilities like measuring the blood pressure, which I think is so important?
Yeah, I think they have a definite upper bound that they won't get past just because of that noise factor, especially on the wrist. So there's a degree of accuracy that no amount of machine learning or whatever is going to get past. So the interesting things are like whether or not the batteries get small enough or powerful enough, because that would help us a lot. And like devices like the BioBeat that I was talking about earlier that like do a lot of these data points reasonably accurately, whether or not we can see that like available to everyone, because those are like, once you get into those medical grade ones that like you can't even buy, that you like a doctor has to buy, you're like at the $2,000 mark. And for cryonics, like we don't care. It's like life or death. And it's like a lot of people in cryonics are somewhat wealthy. And it's like, fine, like if that's what it's going to take to get a life monitoring device. But it'd be nice to see like the Apple Watch get to that point. And I think one of the driving factors is the battery life, because you can add more sensors, you can like do more things to the sensor or to the data on the watch, but the limiting like bottleneck there is the battery. So
Thank you.
Yes, it is interesting to consider what some of the limiting factors might be in the development of these devices. But I agree with Jose, if there were a way to accurately measure blood pressure over time, not just with these periodic cuff-based readings, which can also be affected by stress, because if somebody thinks their blood pressure is being taken, especially if they're in a doctor's office setting, there could be artificially high readings. It's called white coat syndrome, I believe, where essentially a person might have high blood pressure readings at the doctor's office, but normal blood pressure readings in everyday life if they take a reading at home, for example. So it would be really useful to have a device that provides accurate or even fairly accurate continuous readings so that one might be aware of patterns, perhaps, because blood pressure isn't a constant quantity. It varies depending on what you do. So actually, if you're exercising, your blood pressure is going to be much higher than your resting blood pressure, and that's fine. I was told essentially if your blood pressure doesn't go up when you exercise, then something is wrong with you. You might have this orthostatic hypotension condition that actually some people develop as a result of COVID. So definitely quite a useful type of measurement. Now, in terms of,
I
yes,
have one comment. It seems to me that if the battery is the problem, then it could use like its own little generator. I mean, they make like clothes that you can charge your cell phone, and it gets energy from. Well, I'm not sure the exact technology on that. Walking around, or maybe it's friction thing or whatever. But I mean, there are these devices and ways to do it. I would think that instead of having a battery, you make it somehow generate its own electricity that it needs, and then it's just good for its duration.
yeah, I figure like we don't have to do this in cryonics, because if there's so much market demand for this, like for a cell phone that lasts longer, for like anything, that like the pressure is there. Like if it was possible, like I think it would be happening. I've seen this one device from Asia that like charges itself somehow from like, it takes the heat byproducts from its own operation and like somehow cycles that back in to not have to be charged. It's just a perpetual kind of thing. But it's just not enough power. They can't get enough power that way. But yeah, I think that's what people have been saying. Like the Cryonics alarm is just around the corner. We keep thinking that the battery improvement is just going to be around the corner, and so far, there's so much market pressure for cell phones and stuff to have better battery life, and it's just you're much bigger battery to work with there, much more space, and still it's not happening yet for some reason.
indeed. Now, our friend Didier Cornell has joined us in the chat, and he wonders, do you have any ideas regarding how to possibly share data for all of these devices for purposes of scientific research? Like if there's a lot of data collected from many individuals who use fitness trackers, and there could be some insights into common patterns, like not just patterns in, say, heart rates for different types of activities for people at different levels of health and fitness, but also patterns in how the devices might air. So if you have data from tens of thousands of people and there are certain situations where a wearable device would lead to false positives or not register a heart rate or have some other aberrations, would it be easier to detect that if you have some sort of data sharing mechanism that people could opt into and disclose their tracking information?
Yeah, I'm not really sure how much like the large companies are already doing this, like how much Apple is already doing this, because they have a lot of information on you. Like even when I build my so I built my own Cryonics alarms and I wear my own solution. It's like I know I can look at where I was all the time, like how much I was moving, like what my heart rate was. Like I can put a pretty complete picture together, and then also if I could get electrodermal activity and see how stressed I was, like nervous system activity, like the lie detector method, like I can suddenly I know like quite a bit about my life or someone's life, and you can start to fill in the gaps. I think the big companies are probably doing this to some extent. With my approach for cryonics monitoring, so I just started an organization, cryonicsmonitoring.org, and I'm taking like the long view with it, because when I first started, I thought, okay, I build an app. We just need an app. We're going to build it like not in a weekend maybe, but maybe 3 months. Build this app, and then Cryonics people will have this app, and then we'll just carry on. But I realized like with technology is going to keep advancing. There's going to be new sensors. There's going to be people have different preferences for kinds of solutions. I thought this is actually a long-term project that I'm just going to be committed to, like make a commitment to. And so part of our like way of thinking about this, like if you work in software development, there's something called data-driven development. You're always gathering as much data as you can, building monitors, making decisions based on what you're seeing, from that data on like usability and, all kinds of things. And so we're taking that approach with Cryonics monitoring to try and like gather information for our like users. When do they get false positives? Who gets the most false positives? Not who like by name, but like, what type of user gets the most false positives in what situations, what time of day, and building a picture of what that looks like for cryonics monitoring so that we could make better decisions about how to design it, like what other features to add to prevent that, and be able to like show the user, like, look, you always get this false positive in the morning. Can you just stop the watch when you like have a shower, or like whatever it is, so that people can see, well, this is what I'm doing and I'm not covered for monitoring under this circumstance. So yeah, just gathering as much data as possible, storing that data in database, making dashboards and things that people can understand, like visually, just looking at it. I think that's like the way to go with this. Like, there's no easy solution here. It's going to be, all those pieces have to come together in order to make it work. So, yeah.
Yes, indeed. We have some comments from Sergey Gubkin, who writes, blood pressure at work will be higher than at home because if you are working physically, your body pumps blood. And if you work mentally, chances are you are under huge pressure and lots of stress. So yes, blood pressure can be affected by those kinds of factors and activities. Carlos Nato writes, we need to bring a frozen animal back, then cryonics will be undeniable in his view. Some animals are able to do this naturally, and they may give us hints. So what do you think about this, Nikki? Because you mentioned cryopets as well. Do you think there is any realistic possibility to bring an entire, say, mammal back from cryopreservation? Because that could, as Carlos noted, really affect public perception and perhaps give rise to significantly greater increase in humans expressing an interest in cryopreservation.
Yeah, so it's the difficult part is, the brain. So there has been rabbit kidney work, right, where someone presented this at Alcor 50. I'm blanking on it. I think it was Greg Fahey, that they took the rabbit kidney down to like minus 130 and then back up, and then it worked a little bit for like some period. I think it was like 9 or 10 days or something, however long this experiment duration was. And that was really exciting. Like everyone at the conference, I remember, was like cheering, like we're just absolutely thrilled. You think, oh, this is it. Like what we're doing makes so much sense. Why isn't everyone doing it? Like after you saw that experiment, you're like, yeah, this is like the cryoprotectant, they got the right toxicity, the temperature went down like at the right speed. They got it all right and it worked. And then you think, well, why can't they do this to the brain? And so while the brain is a lot more delicate, the cryoprotectant concentrations that you need to like protect the cell from, ice crystal formation and other things, ends up being toxic for the brain. You have like just other issues that come up. And so I think like it would be really exciting if they could do this to a brain. I think that's like the big like landmark. And so you'd have to go, like they've done really small, like some sort of worm. I can't remember the name of the worm, but you can also, if you like cryopreserve really quickly with the ideal temperature, like with the ideal concentration, you can bring like, I think it was, some kind of worm they brought back, but like that's not compelling enough for people. They showed that like it could still, it had learned, it remembered like that, something that it had learned. But yeah, I think that's like a really long way off, unfortunately.
Yes, indeed. And Rudy Hoffman writes in our chat, we are a long way from bringing back a full small animal from liquid nitrogen temps. We have organs that are functional after cryopreservation, but not consistently. And the C. elegans worm revival after cryopreservation, this occurred in 2014. There was a paper published in 2015, persistence of long-term memory in vitrified and revived C. elegans, co-authored by Natasha Vita-Moore and Daniel Barranco. So they performed this kind of research, but it's indeed, unfortunately, the case that higher animals than C. elegans have not yet been fully revived from cryopreservation. Rudy also writes, we use cryo as a bridge to that technology. People who are waiting for the technology to be proven have missed the point that cryo is designed to get us there, and doing nothing provides no safety net. So now Daniel Tweed is wondering if we're going to reach some sort of consensus as to what the best device is before the conclusion of the salon. I'm not sure we can do that in a session like this, given that research is ongoing, but I am curious to hear you compare and contrast a solution that would be based on the Fitbit Sense 1 versus a ground-up solution which you think may be more reliable for cryonicist purposes. But how would they compare in terms of the features as well as the work required for each of them?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. So you have, with a ground-up solution, you can have access to that heart rate sensor, the raw data stream all the time if you want, and you can look at the signal to noise ratio and potentially, make an alert on that. Because when you dip below 20 beats per minute, presumably the noise is dominating instead of the signal, which is why a lot of these just do weird stuff. So I would love to have like the access to that raw data so that I can like experiment with, what does it do when there's no signal? What does the noise look like? Is there anything that I can do, machine learning or otherwise, to like say, this is no beats per minute. This is, nothing else. So there's that. Although there are products on the market that will give you that raw data stream, the battery life will run out in like 6 hours. So it's like, it's not a feasible solution, but just to experiment with that. But so maybe you can take samples periodically every 10 minutes, and then this is what noise looks like. This is what no signal looks like. It's just for experimentation purposes. The other thing is that you really want to have like cellular on the device, because you never want the point of failure to be your phone died, your Bluetooth was too far out of range, or your phone was doing an update, or the phone decided to throttle the app closed unexpectedly for some other reason. All those things are like really dumb reason to like have a bad cryopreservation. And so if you can put like a cell, like a 4G chip onto the device that you're building from the ground up, and you have 100% control over the communication, you knock out a lot of the problems with just that alone. And so there are some, like the Samsung Galaxy watches have that, but then they don't have the other features that you're looking for. And so it would be bringing together all those things that you want that are possible on the wrist of something that you would wear that's like, has other features that you would like. And you bring it all together into one thing that you control. So there's no like update coming from the outside, that's going to knock your solution off. And you don't know that. People are wearing it. They trust you. You've tested it, but then an update ruins it, and you're just not vulnerable to any of that either. So it just really, I think, is the way to go. Yeah.
Yes, and I can definitely see the advantages of a dedicated solution. Of course, it will take some time and resources to develop. Now, Ben Ballweg is wondering, how do you build your own bio-tracker? What would be the steps involved? What would be the kind of investment that would be necessary to create such a dedicated device and then to mass produce it as well?
I think in the beginning, you just build something really big that like doesn't have a nice UI, that doesn't have a nice display, just to do the research. So you do like an Arduino, and the sensors are very cheap. You can just buy like an accelerometer for like $6, and you just like plug it in, or, whatever it is, like depending on what scale you're actually dealing with. And so, yeah, you just start with the actual, just the board, and you just start adding the things that you want to add and develop and do the research that you want. When you get to the point of actually wanting to manufacture this, though, like that's where the difficulty comes in the scale and the expense, because the other aspect is that you don't know exactly what Fitbit and Apple are doing to optimize battery life. When I've worked with open source before, I did Lily T Go, which is like this, it's an open source Fitbit type tracker, like it's a band type, it's not a full smartwatch. I started doing what I wanted with it. Like I started running the sensors how I wanted to do it. And it like the battery drained really quickly. It's something that like Fitbit can last like 5 or 6 days. So they're doing something. There's been an engineering step that is proprietary that has, optimized, what runs when, and like simplified the code so that it has like 6. I don't know that I could build something, obviously, probably not me, but with, research funding, and you get someone who has that kind of expertise to put that together to try and, optimize that component as well, or at least get it to where the ones on the market are. So I think that's a major challenge. I think like you could do a really like a hacky solution with your 3D printed like case and stuff. Like it would be a long project, and there'd be several steps, and you get to a point where there would be a financial investment. You'd have to make more than you would actually be selling and all that kind of thing. So.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed. And of course, the number you manufacture would depend on how many cryonicists are interested in such a device, though it has been pointed out that others may be interested in it as well. People who are monitoring their cardiac health, for example, and they want a rapid emergency response that could save them if they're experiencing heart failure or cardiac arrest, for instance. I think there could be an added market for that kind of device among those groups of patients. Now, Didier also wonders, what is the best platform to share data from wearable devices? Like if people want to do that, or if they want to contribute to sharing data for use by researchers, do you know of any readily available platforms that could collect the data and make the data available to researchers?
I don't. No, I haven't come across that yet. I see like experiments where people are trying to remove the person. Like, for instance, people are building like artificial limbs that have like pretend blood flow. People are doing crazy stuff in this space, but I haven't seen one where like you could like be a person that volunteers. So yeah.
All right. Well,
isn't that kind of what CureDAO does? Basically, that's why I was mentioning Mike Saint earlier, because I think you guys would really get along. He's brilliant, and I think he's kind of doing that. I mean, he's got some kind of it's got an app that I didn't actually go all the way through it. I'll be honest, but I looked at it all and enough to know that it looks pretty cool and might be appropriate, or maybe, I don't know. Just a thought. Back
Yes,
to
we
you.
had a virtual Enlightenment Salon with CureDAO, including Mike Sin, Lucas Vogel, and Andreas Melheda on August 7th, 2022, where we discussed their idea for a platform where people could share their health data and it would be made available for research purposes. But again, there's the caveat of I don't know how far along they are to publicly deploying that kind
Yeah,
of
I don't think they
functionality.
got any kind of wearable device or anything going on. But he's real brilliant at organizing things. So if you don't know him, I don't know. Maybe you guys, should meet. I'll drop this link for this show into it to him and let him know or something.
Yes, that would be helpful. And for those who are interested in watching that salon, here is the link to it as well. So now we are reaching the conclusion of our salon. I would like to give any of our panelists the opportunity to make any final comments or ask Nikki any final questions. Who would like to go first? Let's see. How about Ben?
No volunteers. I have 0 questions, but thanks for coming. Sorry I asked you the thing about the cartoons. I just thought it was really weird and maybe it might be fun. So, but thanks, you're awesome. That's
Thank
it.
you.
All right, Ben, any final comments or questions?
Thank you for your time today, Nikki. It was a really fun deep dive into how we could maybe hopefully track our metrics and be able to respond as appropriate for emergencies.
Yeah, sorry, it's so much bad news. I feel like I'm like the bad news person. Everything sucks, it's bad, and it's not working. Yeah.
Well, Jose, you are, of course, always quite the optimist. So what optimistic commentary would you have for us today?
Well, talking about cryonics, Mike Perry, who works at Alcor, he has said that he believes that the first reanimations could be in the 2050s. And that is absolutely incredible, in the 2050s. Even if it is in the 2060s, it will be fantastic to have the first human reanimations. So, Nikki, what do you think about that? Did you talk to Mike Perry about his forecast?
So until I don't know how closely you guys are following like the Chat GPT stuff and all the recent like AI summer stuff that's happening, but I became like a Singularity skeptic. Like I started out like really interested in it, and then was like, this isn't going to happen. That's partially why I got into cryonics. But then with this resurgence of AI and like all these, I don't. My timelines are like, they're up in the air again. Like I don't know. Like I think maybe there could actually be a singularity soon, which is like, it's really exciting because it's like, it's not just reanimation and cryonics that's interesting. It's like all the other stuff. Like there's the whole point that you're doing it is because you want to live and, enjoy life. So, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I do think ChatGPT and generative AI programs that can create art are quite fascinating, and their capabilities certainly exceed what I thought would have been possible in the near term. So it does warrant reevaluating some of our timeframes. I just hope that longevity escape velocity can arrive sooner than many project. Of course, Aubrey de Grey's time frame of about 13 to 15 years now is quite a hopeful time frame, and I am definitely on Aubrey's side in seeking to help bring that about, since I'm one of the directors of his Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation. But we need progress in all of these areas simultaneously: cryonics, AI, life extension, rejuvenation, nanotechnology, and other means of alleviating the problems that humankind faces today. There is a problem.
Gennady, let me talk about longevity escape velocity, because as you know, Ray Kurzweil, he talks about 2029. If we make it to 2030, we will gain 1 year per year we survive. So we are much closer even than Aubrey de Grey believes, according to Ray Kurzweil.
Well, of course, as someone who wants longevity escape velocity to arrive as soon as possible, I hope that Ray Kurzweil is correct in his forecast. There is a promising initiative that Dan Elton mentioned in the YouTube chat. He writes that the NIH's All of Us research program is collecting data from wearables, and here's a statement from the NIH. The All of Us research program WEAR study has begun. As part of the WEAR study, you could receive a new Fitbit to wear at no cost to you. And Rudy Hoffman echoes this. He says that he has signed up and donated a lot of data and given them access to his health portal. And he would encourage others to check out that initiative. Dan Elton states that he has signed up as well. And Rudy Hoffman would like to thank us and Nikki for her integrity and willingness to do this deep dive. I would like to echo that as well. So, Nikki, we always like to give our guest the opportunity to have the last word. So, what are some closing comments that you would like to make to conclude this session?
I'd like to say that this problem is difficult in that there's a lot of details, but it is possible to get a good solution, something that we'd be happy with. An alarm that goes off in an hour is a lot better than the stuff that we have available right now. And so to not feel sad about it or disappointed, it's going to take time. It's going to take development. Cryonics is small. You have, open source development. There's thousands of developers make Linux. There's a few of us working on this in Cryonics. So I've started an organization, cryonicsmonitoring.org. I'm trying to bring more people into it. Maybe do a donation thing, some kind of sponsorship so that we can keep moving this forward, bring professional standards in, get things done, start building something. So I think I'm excited about it. I constantly talk about the problems, but I'm excited about it. I think something good is possible, and that especially if you're an older chronicist right now, I think that there'll be something worthwhile in a year or 2 years that would come out of our efforts directly. So yeah, that's my personal pitch.
Yes, thank you very much, Nikki. And again, I encourage everyone to check out cryonicsmonitoring.org and keep apprised of Nikki's endeavors, which are really quite promising. Art Ramon also writes that hopefully geopolitics does not veer things too far off. Yes, we need as much geopolitical stability as possible for scientific advances to continue and for this research to have the possibility of benefiting as many people as possible throughout the world. And Rudy also says, thank you all for your vision for a better future for us all. And hooray for Nikki Olson. And thank you to all of our viewers for attending this virtual Enlightenment Salon, for the thoughtful questions and comments. As usual, we have succeeded in having a multifaceted, interdisciplinary conversation that touches on many aspects of health and longevity and ways in which people can live longer and better and have some help from devices that, while they are imperfect, certainly are leaps and bounds ahead of what was available even a decade earlier. And we appreciate Nikki's explorations into the functionality of those devices and their limitations, as well as her efforts to build a dedicated life monitoring solution. So until next time, live long and prosper.
Live long.